After reading the Batman script for the first time, Michael Keaton sat down with Tim Burton. Burton asked him what he thought. Keaton said, "I have a take on the character, but the studio will never let me do it. I think that this guy never processed the loss of his parents, so he has to dress up as a bat in order to cope with it." Burton nodded. Keaton wasn't sure what the director was thinking. "Do you think they'll let us do that?" Burton replied, "Let's find out." Keaton had cracked the code to playing Batman, but little did he know he'd also discovered a profound truth at the heart of the character. The creation of a great Batman story requires a kind of duology. In order to do it, you need two people, the Batman and the Bruce Wayne. But in order to explain myself, I'll have to show you some of them. Here's the first. Hearing this might shock you, but Tim Burton was kind of a weird kid. Like many of his characters, Burton grew up in the suburbs and felt out of place there. After studying film at Cal Arts, Burton made a surprise runaway hit with the supernatural comedy Beetlejuice.
It's showtime.
The unexpected success of the film and the gothic sensibility Burton brought to it landed him the opportunity to make Batman, the next big summer blockbuster. It was then that Burton met the other side of his Batman coin. This guy, super producer Jon Peters. I know Peters didn't look much like Batman on the surface, but he was as scrappy as they come. A teenage runaway who had served time in a juvenile detention facility, Peters was ambitious, aggressive, and combative.
I'm a fighter. I'm an aggressive guy. I knew how to make a movie with a guy that could kick ass, you know?
In his 20s, Peter was married to actress Leslie Ann Warren. When they were walking down the street one day, a man in a passing car yelled a disparaging comment about one of Warren's movies. Peters chased the car down and dragged the man out of it. He was about to punch the heckler when the man said, "I'm in your wife's acting class. I'm her friend Jack. I was just making a joke." The man was Jack Nicholson, who quickly became Peters' friend. Eventually, Peters, a gifted hairdresser, began working for Barbra Streisand, and soon after, the two were married. Peters' ambition and charisma were overwhelming, and he eventually worked his way up to a high-powered producing position at Warner Brothers. It was then that he was put in charge of Batman. Peters and Burton were polar opposites, but that proved necessary for the success of the film. Burton was overwhelmed by the size of the production and needed guidance and reassurance. Peters took him under his wing and protected him. At one point, a frustrated Burton ran off the set crying during a production meeting. "We loved him, took care of him," Peters said.
Peter and I always had a vision of this picture. Tim came in and began to make all those pieces possible.
Peters' power in Hollywood was immense, and he was the one who convinced his friend Jack Nicholson, who he'd nearly punched 20 years earlier, to join the Batman film.
Jack is dead, my friend. You can call me Joker.
Jack Nicholson heard about Batman and the Joker for the first time on Witches of Eastwick. And I said, just to get your mind off it, let me tell you about a movie I want to do called Batman, and I think you should play the anyhow.
In the 80s, it was considered a big deal for a star as famous as Nicholson to join a comic book movie, a genre thought to be for children. But Peters secured Burton a blank check, allowing him to do whatever he wanted. Burton hired Anton Furst, the production designer of films like A Clockwork Orange, and created a new iconic look for Gotham City. But Peters' influence also put strain on Burton. Overcome with the fear of a massive failure, the production of the movie was largely miserable for Burton. He later described it as the worst period of his life.
It's a new thing for me, yeah.
Peters also interfered with the story of the film, looking to keep Burton's moodiness in check. Peters didn't want Batman to turn into one of Burton's sad loner characters. He insisted on crowd-pleasing blockbuster elements for the film, including an action climax on top of a bell tower. He ordered a massively expensive new set to be built for the sequence, dissatisfied with the film's original ending. Peters believed that the middle-aged Nicholson was no match for Keaton's Batman, and he needed to spice up the finale. Burton was anxious about the changes. During filming of the scene, Nicholson asked Burton why the Joker would climb up to the bell tower. "Why am I walking up all these stairs? Where am I going?" Burton had to tell him that he didn't know. He described it as the most frightening moment of my life.
He's a very good actor, and the fact is he's so good, it doesn't matter.
Regardless of Burton's feelings about the experience, Batman was a mammoth hit. It shattered box office records and changed the way movies were marketed and merchandised in Hollywood forever. Burton and Peters had created the perfect Batman for 1980s America.
This evening, Los Angeles has gone bats.
They had struck the perfect balance between Bruce Wayne and Batman. Peters had Bruce Wayne's charm and Batman's toughness. Burton had Batman's gothic style and the tortured soul of a young Bruce Wayne. Burton was a misunderstood kid who created new personas to express himself, and Peters forced him to face the world on the biggest scale of his career. Peters was not involved with the film's sequel, Batman Returns, a movie I love dearly. After the success of the first, the studio let Burton do whatever he wanted for Returns, and he took the opportunity to go a lot darker and a lot weirder. Despite my love for it, Batman Returns was largely rejected by the American public and even angered McDonald's, looking for a kid-friendly tie-in.
Look! The Batmobile!
Batman Returns still has many passionate fans, but for most people, the Batman-Wayne balance was out of whack. It was a delicate balance that was first established nearly 60 years earlier. Bill Finger was an artist for hire in New York in the 1930s. Comics were starting to take off, and publishers needed them fast. They would contract out the art to small companies of artists who would send the finished pages back for publication. Bill Finger had been hired by another artist, Bob Kane, to work on cartoon animal and superhero books. One night, Kane arrived at Finger's apartment in a panic. He'd promised a publisher a new superhero by the end of the weekend. He presented Finger with what he had so far: a man in red tights, a mask, and bat wings. His name, the Batman. Finger made a couple improvements. He added a cowl, a bat symbol on the hero's chest, and changed the wings to a cape. Eventually, he would add a utility belt, a police ally named Commissioner Gordon, a butler named Alfred, villains like Catwoman and Scarecrow, and even a tragic origin story for the character. He even named the Batmobile and the Batcave. Basically, Bill Finger created Batman, but since Bob Kane was the one dealing with the publishers, he got to put his name on the stories. In all the stories they worked on together, only Bob Kane received credit. Ownership rights and creator credit were pretty much unheard of in comics at the time, but Kane was a shrewd businessman. He not only got rich off of his creation, he became a celebrity. Even now, most Batman fans will list his name as the sole creator of the character.
The writer of Batman, the fellow who created Batman, Bob Kane, was a friend of mine.
The legend of Bill Finger, on the other hand, continued to diminish. Not overly concerned with credit, Finger started to become upset when the character he had such a big part in creating became famous, and Kane with it.
Bob Kane using me as a kind of tool all this time, most for his own paycheck.
A fan interviewed him about his side of the story and circulated the interview in the comics community, but Kane acted quickly to discredit the story. Only later in his life would he admit to Finger's contributions, but by then it would be too late. Bill Finger passed away, penniless and relatively unknown, in the 70s. He was succeeded by his son Fred, who died of AIDS in the 90s. That was the end of the Finger bloodline. Or at least, that's what Mark Nobleman thought. Nobleman, a journalist, was doing research for a book on Bill Finger and became obsessed with his life story. A lifelong Batman fan, Nobleman thought it was unjust that Finger never got credit for his contributions.
Secret identities are for superheroes, not the guys behind them.
But in order to change this, Nobleman needed a blood heir for a legal challenge. Nobleman believed that the bloodline ended with Fred, but one night, out of desperation, he called every Finger in the phone book. Eventually, he discovered a nephew. "This guy's calling about Uncle Bill," the nephew yelled to a family member. Nobleman asked if he had any information or recollections about Finger. The nephew said, "What you should really do is talk to his granddaughter."
When I first heard those words, I feel like I saw a movie marquee and it said the heir to Batman.
Nobleman was shocked. He had believed Fred to be gay and never to have adopted, but in truth, Fred was bisexual, and he had a daughter.
How are you?
Athena Finger had known her grandfather created Batman all her life, but she didn't like to bring it up. As a child, most people hadn't believed her, and she thought that there was little evidence of her grandfather's contributions. When Nobleman contacted her, he encouraged her to mount a legal challenge against Warner Brothers. Athena and her half-sister, an attorney, did just that, and Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice became the first film to acknowledge Bill Finger as a co-creator of Batman. The story of Bill Finger, Bob Kane, Mark Nobleman, and Athena Finger is chronicled in much more detail in the 2017 film Batman and Bill, a movie I recommend checking out if you are interested in the subject. One of the things that struck me most about the story is that Finger had written Batman's origin. In 7 panels, Finger created what is arguably the most important part of the character. Batman's origin is something almost every adaptation returns to, but the best version arguably was drafted in the early 2000s in a garage in Los Angeles. This is where David S. Goyer would meet Christopher Nolan to discuss ideas for a new Batman script they were developing. Nolan was coming off the acclaimed indie hit Memento and had recently proven that it wasn't a fluke with the cop thriller Insomnia. Nolan had intended to use this cachet with the studio to make a film about Howard Hughes, but ultimately couldn't crack the project. Instead, Warner Brothers offered Nolan the keys to one of their biggest franchises, Batman. David S. Goyer had written the Blade films, one of the first in the second wave of superhero films, and Nolan called him for his take on the character. Nolan hadn't grown up with the Batman comics, so Goyer had to give him a crash course. Does he have to have a utility belt? Nolan asked. Does it have to be yellow? Nolan and Goyer shared a common goal: to bring Batman into the real world.
There shouldn't be anything Batman really does because of style. It should always be function over form.
But Goyer insisted that their version keep as much of the comic book character intact as possible. He brought Nolan to meet with DC's Batman editorial staff, the first filmmaker to do so. He outlined 10 elements of the character that he described as sticky, story beats that had stayed the same in the 70 years since Batman was created. Goyer described this as story Darwinism, reasoning that the best elements of the character would also last the longest. But Nolan had other concerns as well. Growing up in Britain, Nolan was attuned to the strict class divisions of the country. He worried his home country would have trouble accepting a billionaire hero. He'd struggled with guilt over his own privilege as well. After college, Nolan had traveled Africa on philanthropic trips, working as a cameraman in support of a charity for Mozambican refugees. Nolan was a rich kid trying to shed that part of himself. He didn't need to. Because for Batman Begins, he found the perfect mirror image in Goyer. From the start of his career, Goyer was brash and confident. He got his first agent in by calling the agent's office every day for weeks, until he finally picked up the phone.
And I said, I'm about to graduate from film school, and I'm going to be a really big writer someday, and if you don't sign me, you're going to regret it.
He was signed. Goyer was successful quickly, and by his mid-20s, he had already written a handful of action films. But a writing mentor told Goyer he didn't have enough life experience to write about.
My writing mentor, one of his gripes with young writers like myself is that we wanted to start writing films without actually living any of our lives.
So, like Nolan, Goyer traveled the world, eventually ending up in a remote area of Tibet. It was these two experiences, those of Nolan and Goyer, that were synthesized into the first act of Batman Begins, where Bruce Wayne has rejected the fortune of his parents' company and traveled to Tibet to fight criminals.
I never would have imagined that that trip would have become the basis for the beginning of Batman Begins, and it did.
Another element of the collaboration proved fruitful as well. Goyer's love of the comics made sure that Batman Begins remained fun. The movie was satisfying not only because it brought Batman to the modern world, but because fans got to see elements of the comic adapted into Nolan's immaculate, serious aesthetic. The Batcave, the Batmobile, Alfred, the Scarecrow, and more were injected with new life by Nolan's inspired take. Now here's where I should probably acknowledge that generally, Goyer's work isn't nearly as strong as Nolan's. but I still believe that Goyer was the perfect collaborator on Batman Begins. Together with co-writer Jonathan Nolan, producer Emma Thomas, and the rest of the cast and crew, Nolan and Goyer made a modern Batman movie that connected with the movie-going public worldwide. And they did so as another perfect double act, Nolan's suave, intellectual Bruce Wayne and Goyer's brash, fanboy Batman. And this is a dichotomy that I can't help but keep returning to. In fact, a lot of my favorite Batman stories reckon with the balance between these two personas. Batman Ego by the great Darwin Cook makes this dynamic unsettlingly literal, as Bruce Wayne does battle with a creepy, separate manifestation of Batman directly tied to his own survivor's guilt. In Batman the Animated Series, the classic episode Perchance to Dream has Bruce Wayne waking up to a world where he has never become Batman and his parents are still alive. He discovers that Batman still exists, and again does battle with his alter ego. Kevin Conroy, the voice of Batman, described it as his favorite episode, and it's easy to see why. It's an episode that feels like it cuts to the tragic core of the character. Batman, a reaction to Bruce's grief, is a part of him now. It can't be removed. The 70s story Night of the Stalker, considered by many fans to be one of the best Batman stories ever told, finds Batman arriving at a bank robbery too late and witnessing a gang of robbers gun down a couple in front of their child. Batman snaps and chases the criminals out of Gotham to a hideout in the woods, where he takes them down one by one. Like Keaton's interpretation, this story portrays Batman as a trauma response. Witnessing the shooting triggers an intense and painful PTSD flashback. The graphic novel Kingdom Come imagines Batman as a totalitarian fascist who has installed anti-crime bat robots across Gotham. A despondent Superman tries to appeal to his better nature. More than anyone else in the world, when you scratch everything away from Batman, you're left with someone who doesn't want to see anyone die. In Kingdom Come, and in most of the best Batman stories, Batman and Bruce are tied together by trauma and the desire to shield innocent people from it. But the balance between Batman's raw emotions and the kind and controlled Bruce Wayne has to remain in balance. If Batman completely loses sight of the frightened kid he once was, that very same fear will consume him. The secret identity isn't just a strategic advantage, it's a necessary psychological split. When Batman takes off the mask, he can go back to being a regular person. All of the artists I've discussed in this video are very different, but some element of this dynamic remains intact. One of them is usually better with people, and that can't help but remind me of another famous pair of creators, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. Now, Stan Lee definitely contributed more to his characters than Bob Kane, and he was never as out of control as Jon Peters, but Lee, like Kane, was stingy with credit. Like Goyer, he was a champion of his characters, and like Peters, he was a natural showman. Meanwhile, Jack Kirby, co-creator of many of Stan's most famous characters, is a name known, for the most part, exclusively in comic circles.
I always marveled at the fact that Jack was able to design so many varied characters and yet make each one totally different than the other.
Kirby and Lee had many fallings out throughout their lives, and during one, Kirby started writing for DC. He started working on a title called Mr. Miracle, and while he was there, he debuted a new villain named Funky Flashman. Funky Flashman was an annoying guy with glasses and a beard who kept stealing ideas from Mr. Miracle. Comic fans and creators immediately recognized him as a mean-spirited parody of 70s-era Stan Lee. Lee and Kirby eventually made up, kind of, but this character always stuck with me. To be successful, you need talent, but do you also need a Funky Flashman to hype you up? The general wisdom in most creative fields is that you need both talent and connections. No talent and you can't back yourself up with good work. But no connections? You could be making the greatest work in the world and no one would see it. This is where someone like Bob Kane comes in. Kane, Lee, and Peters were smart businessmen who were able to bring artists' work to an audience they never would have reached. Does that make them good people? No, but it's interesting to think what would have happened to Batman or Spider-Man without them. I don't think this is unique to artists either. Almost any industry requires you to interact with people, and if you're not the best at that, it probably helps to have someone who is. And judging by these stories, the only thing that makes sense to me is to work with people who you trust. Everybody needs someone who will showcase the best of them without eventually screwing them over. Bruce Wayne is deep down a scared and traumatized kid, but only with the help of the Batman mask, his protective double identity, is he able to truly face the world.